Hello there everybody, Martin here from Affinity for Commander. Today we have another great gameplay video for you to enjoy, so without further ado, let's take a look at those opening hands. I am playing my Lord Windgrace landfall deck, and keep an opening hand consisting of Broken Bond, Wayward Swordtooth, Explosive Vegetation, Forgotten Cave, Myriad Landscape, a Swamp and a Forest.
Hugo is playing his Lathril Blade of the Elves Elf Tribal deck, and starts the game with a hand of COPPA Horn Scout, Elvish Clan Caller, Elvish Harbinger, Bolas' Citadel, Golgari Rot Farm, Unclaimed Territory, and Wirewood Lodge.
Jack is playing his Ziatora the Incinerator value deck, and keeps a starting hand of Deathrite Shaman, Rushed Rebirth, Solemn Simulacrum, Fabled Passage, Takanuma Abandoned Mire, Undergrove Stadium, and a Swamp.
And finally, Michael is playing as Lathiel, the Bounteous Dawn life gain deck, keeping an opening hand containing Healer's Hawk, Swords to Plowshares, Hunter's Insight, Felidar Sovereign, Exotic Orchard, and 2 planes.
I win the die roll, play Forgotten Cave, and pass to Jack.
Jack plays Undergrowth Stadium, which he used to cast Deathrite Shaman before passing.
Michael plays a Plains, casts Healer's Hawk, and ends his turn.
Hugo plays Unclaimed Territory, naming Elf, and then casts COPPA Horn Scout. Out of mana, he passes to Martin.
I play Myriad Landscape and pass.
Jack plays Fabled Passage, which he immediately sacrifices to put a mountain onto the battlefield, and ends his turn.
Michael plays a second Plains and moves to combat. Here he attacks Hugo with his Hawk, dealing him 1 damage and gaining a life in the process. Moving to his second main phase, Michael casts Serra Ascendant, who enters as a 6/6 with flying and lifelink for 1 mana. Pleased with his turn, Michael passes to Hugo.
Hugo plays Wirewood Lodge and casts Soul Ring. Moving to combat, he attacks Martin with his Elf, dealing him 1 damage, and moves to his post-combat main phase. Here he casts Elvish Harbinger, searching his library for Priest of Titania, and puts her on top of his library before passing.
I begin my turn by casting Soul Ring, play a Forest, and cast Explosive Vegetation. I search my library for 2 swamps, put them into play tapped, and end my turn, to which Jack responds by exiling the explosive veggies in my graveyard with Deathrite Shaman. Michael, Hugo and I each lose 2 life, and Jack proceeds to his turn.
Jack plays a swamp and exiles the Fabled Passage in his own graveyard to generate a green mana with his Shaman. Next he casts Solemn Simulacrum, putting a forest into play from his library, and passes to Michael.
Michael plays Exotic Orchard as his land for turn, and taps out to cast Duelist Heritage. Moving to combat, he attacks Hugo with Serra Ascendant, and me with his bird. Michael gives the monk double strike with his enchantment, and I take 1, and Hugo takes a whopping 12 damage. Michael gains 13 life due to his creature's lifelink, and if nothing more to do, passes the turn.
Hugo starts his turn by casting Llanowar Elves, and then casts his commander, Lathril Blade of the Elves. Next he plays Golgari Rot Farm, returning his lodge to his hand, and ends his turn.
In my turn I cast Wayward Swordtooth, play Warped Landscape, and play a Forest. Not wanting to cast my commander with a huge flyer in play, I pass to Jack.
Jack begins his turn by casting Nissa Vastwood Seer. He searches his library for a forest, puts the land into his hand, and plays it. Moving to combat, he attacks Hugo with his Sad Robot, and Michael uses his Duelist Heritage to give the Golem double strike. Hugo declares no blocks, taking 4 damage, and Jack passes the turn.
Michael plays Sungrass Prairie and moves to combat. Jack responds to this by channeling Boseiju Who Endures, destroying Duelist Heritage with the tree's ability. Rather upset by this, Michael attacks me with his Ascendant and Jack with his Hawk. Before damage occurs, I cycle Slippery Cast, and not finding an answer, I take 6 damage. Jack takes 1, Michael gains 7, and moving to his second main phase, Michael taps out to cast his commander, Lathiel Bounteous Dawn. Moving to his end step, Michael puts 7 +1/+1 counters on Healer's Hawk with Lathiel's ability, and with nothing more to do, ends his turn.
Hugo replays Wirewood Lodge and casts Priest of Titania. Next he casts Elvish Clangcaller and moves to combat, where he attacks Martin with his commander.
Rude.
Unable to block, Martin takes 3, and Hugo creates 3 1/1 Elf Warrior tokens with Lathril's ability. Not yet finished, Hugo moves to his post-combat main phase, where he casts Immaculate Magistrate. With nothing more to do, he passes to Martin.
I start my turn by playing a swamp and cast Obnixilis the Fallen. This grants me the city's blessing, and I sacrifice my Myriad Landscape to put 2 forests into play from my library. Obnixilis triggers, and I have Michael lose 6 life before putting 6 +1/+1 counters on the demon. Moving to combat, I attack Michael with Wayward Swordtooth, and he declares no blocks, taking 5 damage. Pleased with the dent I've made in Michael's life total, I pass the turn.
Jack plays a swamp and moves to combat. Here he attacks Martin with his Sad Robot, and Martin blocks Simulacrum with Obnixilis. Before damage occurs, Jack casts Rush Rebirth, targeting his golem. The robot is then destroyed, and Jack puts Topiary Stomper into play from his library. He puts a mountain onto the battlefield from his library with the dinosaur's ETB, which triggers Nissa's ability, transforming her into Nissa Sage Animist. Next, Jack draws a card from Solemn Simulacrum's Death trigger, and with the stack finally empty, moves to his second main phase. Here he activates Nissa's +1 ability, revealing the top card of his library to be Blood Crypt, and puts the land onto the battlefield tapped. Still not finished, Jack exiles the Myriad Landscape in Martin's graveyard to generate a mana with Deathrite Shaman, which he uses to help cast his commander, Ziatora the Incinerator. Happy with the amount of value he's managed to squeeze out of a single go, Jack moves to his end step, where he sacrifices Topiary Stomper to Ziatora's ability. He deals 4 damage to Lathiel, destroying her, and creates 3 treasure tokens before ending his turn.
Michael moves straight to combat, attacking Jack with Healer's Hawk and Hugo with Serra Ascendant. Neither player declares any blocks, and before damage, Michael casts Hunter's Insight, targeting his bird. With no further interruptions, Jack takes 8, Hugo takes 6, and Michael gains 14 before drawing 8 cards.
Value.
In his second main phase, Michael plays a Plains and casts Felwar Stone. Michael then discards down to 7 and passes to Hugo.
In his turn, Hugo taps a variety of elves and lands to cast Bolas's Citadel. He then activates Immaculate Magistrate's ability, targeting Lathril, and Michael responds by casting Swords to Plowshares, also targeting the same elf. Not wishing to see his commander be exiled, Hugo taps Priest of Titania for 10 mana, and then casts Heroic Intervention. This causes Michael's spell to fizzle without a legal target, and Hugo puts 10 +1/+1 counters on his commander. Next, Hugo uses 3 of his remaining floating mana to cast Circle of Dreams Druid, and moves to combat. Here he attacks Michael with his commander, dealing him 13 damage and creating 13 Elf Warriors as he does so.
That board is really getting out of hand now.
Safe behind an army of weenies, Hugo passes the turn.
I begin my turn by casting my commander, Lord Windgrace, and use his +2 ability to discard and draw. Next I cast Broken Bond, targeting Bolas' Citadel, and Hugo responds to this by sacrificing the Citadel and 9 of his elves to activate the Citadel's 3rd ability. Jack, Michael and I each lose 10 life in this way, and I play Command Tower as my land for turn. I have Hugo lose 3 life thanks to my Fallen Planeswalker, put 3 +1/+1 counters on the demon, and move to combat. Here I attack Michael with my now 12/12 Obnixilis, dealing him 12 damage, and end my turn.
Jack starts his turn by activating Nissa's +1 ability, putting Rootbound Crag into play in this way. Next he exiles the land in Martin's graveyard with his Shaman, and casts Sire of Insanity, much to Michael's despair. Not yet finished, Jack pays 2 mana to cast Galter, Primal Hunger, and channels Takenuma Abandoned Mire. He mills 3, returning the Solemn Simulacrum in his graveyard to his hand, and sacrifices his treasure tokens to help cast the Artificial Man. Jack searches his library for a swamp, puts the land into play tapped, and moves to combat. Here he attacks Windgrace with his commander, lowering his loyalty to 1, and proceeds to his end step. Here Jack sacrifices Galter to deal 12 damage directly to Hugo's face, and with the trigger on the stack, Martin responds by sacrificing Warped Landscape. He searches his library for a forest, puts into play, and Obnixilus's ability triggers. Martin chooses to have Hugo lose 3 life before putting 3+1/+1 counters on his demon, and Ziatora's ability resolves, dealing Hugo a lethal amount of damage. Jack creates 3 treasure tokens, and immediately sacrifices them to cast Krosan Grip, destroying Martin's Soul Ring.
Now that is uncalled for.
Cyro's Stagnation's ability then resolves, forcing everybody to discard their hands, and Jack passes to Michael.
In his turn, Michael moves straight to combat, attacking Jack with his Healer's Hawk. Unable to block the flyer, Jack takes 8, and Michael gains 8 thanks to his bird's lifelink. In his post-combat main phase, Michael recasts his commander, and moving to his end step puts 8+1/+1 counters on Sarah Ascendant with the Unicorn's ability. Unable to do anything else, he discards his hand and passes.
Martin begins his turn by casting Mina and Den Wildborn, and activates their ability. He returns a mountain to his hand to give Obnixilis Trample, replays the mountain, and has Michael lose 3 life as he puts 3+1/+1 counters on his former Planeswalker. Martin then activates his Elves ability again, this time giving his Dinosaur Trample, and discards the land to Windgrace's +2 ability. Not yet finished, he plays Temple of the False God as his second land for turn, triggering Obnixilis once more. He has Michael lose another 3 life, puts 3+1/+1 counters on the demon, and casts Varswood Surge, not paying the kicker cost. Martin puts a swamp and a forest onto the battlefield in this way, has Michael lose another 6 life, and puts another 6+1/+1 counters on Obinix. Moving to combat, Martin attacks Michael with his 27/27 Trampley creature, and Michael blocks with his Sarah Ascendant. Michael takes 18 damage, gains 9, and the OP 1-drop is finally destroyed.
Good riddance.
Out of mana, Martin moves to his end step. Here, Michael puts 8+1/+1 counters on his Hawk, as well as a single +1/+1 counter on Martin's Swordtooth as a peace offering. With no further abilities to resolve, Martin ends his turn.
Jack activates Nissa's +1 ability, putting Temple of the False God onto the battlefield in this way, and moves to combat. Here he attacks me with Solemn Simulacrum, and very conscious of my life total, I block with Mina and Den. Jack's creature is destroyed, drawing him a card, and Jack plays a swamp as his land for turn. Next he casts Multani, Yavimai's avatar, and exiles a ramp spell from my graveyard with Deathrite Shaman. Michael and I both lose 2 life, and Jack casts Goblin Darkwellers, casting the Rushed Rebirth in his graveyard with the creature's ETB. Jack targets Multani with the spell, and moves to his end step, where he sacrifices the elemental to his commander's ability. He deals me lethal damage in this way, creates 3 treasure tokens, and searches his library for Junji, the Midnight Sky with Rushed Rebirth. Jack puts the dragon onto the battlefield, and with 2 flying blockers, passes to Michael.
Michael moves to combat, attacking Jack with his now 15/15 Healer's Hawk. Jack double blocks the bird with Junji and Ziatora, resulting in both blockers dying, and Michael gaining 15 life. Jack uses Junji's death trigger to force Michael to discard his hand and lose 2 life, and Michael moves to his end step. Here he puts 15+1/+1 counters on Healer's Hawk, and Jack waits for his Sire Stagnation's ability to resolve before sacrificing a treasure and returning 2 lands to his hand to return the Multani in his graveyard to his hand. Unable to do anything about this, Michael passes the turn.
Jack plays a swamp and exiles a land from Michael's graveyard with his shaman to help recast Ziatora. Next he casts Lord of Extinction, who enters as a 21/21 and moves to combat. Here Jack attacks Michael with Goblin Dark Dwellers, and unable to block the menacing goblins, Michael takes 4 damage. A rather happy Jack then moves to his end step, where he sacrifices Lord of Extinction to Ziatora's ability, dealing Michael lethal damage and winning himself the game. Well, that is it for another game. I hope that you enjoyed watching Jack snatch victory back from a dire situation. I'd like to give a huge thank you to every one of our incredible patrons, without whom we'd be unable to continue making content such as this. Also, be sure to check out our affiliate links in the video description. It won't cost you anything extra to buy your products through these, but it really helps out the channel. And finally, if you really like us, then consider becoming a patron of the channel, where you can find exclusive rewards such as tokens, playmats and pins for as little as $1 a month. That's it for now though guys, we'll see you next time. Stay awesome!